And they even did experiments where they had GPS collars on the bears, and they put the allocation, the relocation rate of when they knew where the bear was to like every 5 minutes so they could watch it. And they'd say, oh, it's laying in the forest. It's bedded down in the forest here. Let's do an experiment and let's approach the bear walking directly into it. But with this is kind of weird, right?
That's so much fun. I want to do that.
Yeah, with the rule of they didn't allow the researchers to go, I think it was something like 50 meters, closer to 50 meters. So they had their handheld GPS. They know the bear is there. They're walking into it. And then they veer off at the last second and they watch the behavior of the bear. More often than not, you know what it did? It hunkered down and went as low as possible to probably like, you can't see me. I'm laying down here next to the tree roots and so on.
Yeah.
Didn't move. Why? Because centuries before, if you moved, that person who came in 50 meters had a bow and arrow or a gun or something else or dogs or whatever, and it would have been dead. It's selected for these bears to be extremely timid.
That's fascinating. Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. So I managed to get someone on to talk about North America's, well, their most charismatic and one of the largest megafauna we got going around. You know, we make teddy bears out of them, all that good stuff. Or not out of them, we make teddy bears of them. The grizzly bear. Really cool. Obviously an incredible animal. Everyone knows about them. The center of a lot of attention when it comes to conservation. And I wanted to get somebody in that's been researching them for a long time and the impact of, you know, human engagement and human disturbance with grizzly bears. So I found a fella who actually, I took his class back in university about 10 years ago, Dr. Scott Nielsen. He is a professor of conservation biology in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta. And also in 2008, he founded the Applied Conservation Ecology Lab, which is a lab that looks into the effects of biodiversity in relation to human disturbance. So forestry and oil and gas and that kind of stuff. And one of the main focuses is grizzly bears, actually. And so he's a big grizzly bear guy. He's been studying them for a lot of years. He knows a lot about them, and he's just passionate about them. He's a great guy to talk to. He's very, like I said, very passionate. He knows how to portray this information in a way that is interesting, and you know he's excited when he's talking, so I love it. And I wanted to thank him for coming on because it was just a great conversation. Really long. You can break it up into a couple chunks if you need to. We talked about things from the status of grizzly bears in Alberta, what's their population should be, what it's like now, the ecology of them, our impact on their population and how we can help, to, you know, the personification of them and, you know, how do we learn to live harmoniously with, you know, a dangerous, arguably monster. So I had to throw that in there. So anyways, sponsors for this week are, West Fraser is the largest sponsor for 2019. Without them funding this thing, I couldn't justify doing it, so I really, really appreciate them, you know, providing the funds to pay for advertising and all that good stuff to make sure I can keep making something decent. And the other two are Greenlink Forestry and Damaged Timber Apparel. Damaged Timber is a apparel company out of Edmonton, and they give 10% of all their profits back to environmental sciences scholarship that you can apply for on their website, damagedtimber.com. They got all kinds of cool hats and toques and stuff. Check them out. They're awesome. So without any further messing around, let's get into it. Let's talk about grizzly bears. Those cool looking monsters roaming around in the boreal forest. I love it. Let's do this. Here we go. So first of all, I guess you're the bear guy, from what I can tell.
Well, yeah, it's one of the species I've worked on for quite a while.
Yeah. So how did you get into bears, or how did that become such a big part of like your research and all that?
Well, I came to Alberta to do my PhD and took a project working on grizzly bears in the Hinton area with at the time was called the Foothills Model Forest.
Right.
And they had started a project in 1998, but in 1999 they started collaring and capturing grizzly bears, primarily under the question of, well, how many grizzly bears are there, and what's the status, and what's the effect of industry. At the time, the study started primarily because of the Cheviot mine proposal, just outside of Catamount. And I came to Alberta in 2000 and started a PhD project on that Foothills Model Forest grizzly bear study at the time. It's since been renamed the Foothills Research Institute. And the study kind of expanded, although initially the Cheviot mine was kind of the entry point on questions about grizzly bears and their response to human activity.
Yeah.
The research lead in Hinton, Gordon Stenhouse, kind of broadened the perspective to also include forestry and oil and gas and other activities. And so for my PhD between 2000 and 2005, worked with Gordon Stenhouse and others and looked at, what's the actual behavioral response and habitats of grizzly bears in the Hinton area.
Gotcha. That's sweet. Yeah. So I've had this question for a while. I figured I'd ask you. It's totally unrelated to research, but bear spray, yay or nay?
Yay.
Yeah. I'm on that page too. I mean, you hear people in the States talk about, a pistol versus bear spray, right? And personally, I think the numbers show that more people end up shooting themselves than the bear. But Canada, we don't have to have that talk, so we could just say, you should have bear spray.
have bear spray, absolutely.
Yeah. Have you ever had to use it or anything?
No, I actually have not.
Okay.
And in those years, I was doing quite a bit of field work in the first number of years of my PhD, and I guess I should describe the approach that we used as my collaborators, Gordon Stenhouse and others, would capture the bears and collar them. So tranquilize them and put a GPS collar on the bear.
Yep.
And we would use that GPS, the telemetry data of where they went and relate it to habitats. But to really understand grizzly bears, we also wanted to physically visit the locations grizzly bears were at.
Oh, okay.
And so we would get the telemetry locations, and we would walk into those locations roughly about 2 weeks after they were there.
Oh, okay.
And you'd expect that after doing a couple summers of doing that, you'd maybe get in a scenario where you'd have to use bear spray, but surprisingly not.
Yeah.
We went in as a group of students, basically, or myself and some summer research assistants. And we definitely made a lot of noise going in just to make sure. And for the most part, a lot of the grizzly bear foraging is on items that, aren't, unless it's a kill site, like a moose or something, they're probably not going to be there 2 weeks later.
No, for sure.
And it's not something that, unless it was a moose or something, it's not something they're going to protect.
No.
So if they heard us coming, they probably, got out of there and no big deal. But interestingly, never had to use it. So I guess I've been lucky in that regard.
Yeah, I've never had to use it either. I've had people spray off old expired ones in my vicinity and had the recoil.
Oh, okay, sure.
Just a light breeze that we didn't notice.
So
that was so I know that I got like a 100th dose of it in my face before, and it wasn't a good time. But
yeah, absolutely, that's why it works. Right?
Yeah. Speaking of this, just reminded me of something you're talking about. Bears on moose kills. I remember one time I was in would have been in the Blackstone Wapiabi Ploughs down in right near Banff, and there was a grizzly bear on a moose kill, and I remember watching it. It was one of the most comical things I've ever seen in nature in my entire life. Like this big silver-tipped grizzly, right?
Yeah.
Was I mean big? I don't know. I have no idea for scale. He was 600 pounds, or if he was whatever. I don't know. But roly-poly fat dude, right? And he's off probably like 500 meters away from us, across a little river, and all I could see was the sheen, right? I'm like, I think that's a bear. And then you look with the binoculars and like, yeah, that is a bear. And you see the ravens kind of flocking around him, right? They kind of land right near him. They'd pester him, take a couple bites, and he'd get up and chase them off, right? Okay, and the ravens were smart enough just to go like just out of his reach, and they'd hover a bit, wait for him. He'd walk he'd walk back to his to the moose kill just kind of pissed off and frustrated, harumphing, right?
Yeah.
And he'd just kind of stand up, he'd stretch and just belly flop on top of the
That is
right
cool.
on top of the moose site, right? It was
yeah.
and just sit there and gorge himself, right? It was I watched him for like an hour just
Cool.
chasing these ravens and then sitting on the moose and then it was the weirdest. Like, it was just so comical. It was, I don't know. It was interesting. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was cool. Anyway, that was a total divergence.
Yeah,
but
no worries. Yeah.
so I guess I would like to get into the state of grizzly bears,
Mhm.
like Alberta, and then in Canada wide right now, and then eventually get into like relate that back to historical ranges and pre-colonialization numbers and stuff like that. So, okay, what is the state currently in like Alberta and in Canada for grizzly bears?
Well, in Alberta, they have threatened status under the Alberta Wildlife Act. Roughly, the $1 million question is how many grizzly bears are there in the province,
Sure.
and folks, particularly Gordon Stenhouse, have been working on that for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And there's some parts of the population or the range that we don't have a really good estimate yet, but a fairly decent guesstimate of.
Sure.
And when you add all those together, you're probably talking roughly 750 grizzly bears.
That's it, eh?
Yeah.
For the whole province.
Plus or minus 100 or somewhere around there.
It seems so few. But...
Well, it is. I mean, from the standpoint of...
I would have thought way more than that, but I guess, okay.
Yeah, from the standpoint of even status, generally you'd want 1,000 breeding individuals, mature animals, to consider them secure.
Oh, okay.
So that, I mean, there's a number of different considerations that went into considering them as a threatened status, but that would be one of them, and certainly 750 total, and that would include some animals that aren't mature yet, like 2-3-year-old grizzly bears, because they can't really distinguish them with the DNA marker capture estimates that are used. It's probably well less than that for mature individuals, and that kind of went into helping determine the conservation status in Alberta as threatened.
So that 1,000, sorry, just to cut you. The 1,000 is just based off of genetic diversity and capacity to not become inbred type thing?
A couple different things. I mean, honestly, the bigger issue would be demographic issues. So you need, roughly 1,000 individuals, especially if they're occurring at low densities over larger ranges, to be more secure demographically. Sure. There are some, genetic aspects of that related to inbreeding, depression, and so on. But generally, the biggest issue on grizzly bears is the demographic challenges. They have very low reproductive rates, and age of maturity is much older as compared to, you'd use an example like black bears. Okay. They can mature and breed at much younger ages. Okay. And the interbirth interval between cubs is much shorter as well. Okay. So grizzly bears, I mean, for grizzly bears, 4 or 5 years old and more productive habitat, they're mature and breeding. But there's a study in Banff National Park almost 2 decades ago, 15 years ago or thereabouts, that demonstrated that in Banff National Park, which you'd consider like absolutely perfect grizzly bear habitat, not necessarily. Actually, age to first reproduction was more like 7 to 8 years old. Inner birth intervals were 5 years or more. That just demonstrating, wow, no wonder why if you have demographic decline, a removal of a few animals, mature animals, especially if they're female, breeding females, could have a demographic effect on their ability to maintain their populations or recover. So what's interesting is they're an omnivore. They're very flexible in the habitats they use, but that age to first reproduction, their fecundity, the number of cubs in their birth interval, isn't that great. And so in a place like Alberta, where the habitats aren't as productive as, say, coastal Alaska or British Columbia, they don't have the densities, the population size to take small declines in the population. And
when you say productive, just to be clear, do you mean like vegetation production, or you mean just like production for the bears themselves?
Well, it's both. So, we consider, like, if you think of the foothills and the mountains of Alberta were cold and dry. Sure. While British Columbia would be wet and warm, or a lot warmer.
So just productive in general.
So productivity in general, because we're a bit drier and we're colder, the length of the growing season is shorter. And because it's a bit drier as well, the overall vegetative productivity is lower. Okay. And it turns out that for bears, being an omnivore, they're foraging on multiple things, including plants, quite a few plants and roots and insects and ungulates. And even the ungulates themselves are related to the productivity of the system. So
that makes sense.
The more productive, the more bears you can have. That's the bottom line. And that can be demonstrated by coastal Alaska, where you have salmon, or British Columbia.
Right.
And everyone says, well, yeah, look at the size of the bears. So their body size can be larger. So the individuals themselves are responding to the productivity and their individual health, but also their densities, their populations. So coastal Alaska can have upwards of 500 bears per 1,000 square kilometers.
Okay.
While the Hinton area, when we first started our study, was just below 5.
Oh, wow.
1/100th the density of bears in Hinton as coastal Alaska.
Huh.
So recently, that same Hinton population, the yellowhead population unit, has doubled. So it went from roughly 5 to about 11 bears per 1,000 square kilometer. But 11 is still not that many when you take it over 1,000 square kilometers.
Okay.
So, grizzly bears, they have larger territory sizes, especially if their habitats aren't as productive. They occur in these low densities. The reproductive rates are low. And although traditionally they had no predator, I mean, they're top dog, right? They're apex predator, right? Yeah. And they evolved in that way. So they evolved to not really consider risk,
of course,
per se. But with humans, well, they're bumping into humans a bit more, and many times that may not be a problem, but there are a few instances where it could be poaching, could even be a vehicle collision, train collision even.
Yeah.
Though that it doesn't seem like, well, there's that many instances of those mortality events. It's a big deal when you don't have many bears to start out with, especially given their low reproductive rates,
the
low fecundity.
Just before this, I was on social media. I saw there was one got shot in the spine over by Whitecourt. Last weekend.
Yeah, I didn't see that one, but yeah.
So obviously they're looking into that, trying to figure out who did that. But yeah, it's So when we were talking about the productivity, and you said it was coastal Alaska had 500 per square 1,000.
Yep, 1,000 square kilometers. Yeah.
And we got 5 to 11 or whatever up in Hinton. You're saying so. Is that a product of just the productivity of the landscape, or do you think it's more than that? Like it's human involvement and all the other stuff too.
So that's the big question that honestly drives a lot of the research I've been doing over the years. So it's a combination of both for sure.
Okay.
In some places like the Wilmore Wilderness, the densities are much higher. Double to triple that even. It depends on where you are, but easily you can get 20 bears per 1,000 square kilometer in the Wilmore. And although historically, I guess I should have mentioned when the status of grizzly bears changed to threatened status in the mid 2000s. Was it 2004 or 6? I'm even forgetting myself. But anyway, when it changed status, there was a moratorium on hunting, and there weren't that many hunting tags that were allocated. A few, and a certain number, half dozen or so, like in the yellowhead unit, and actually in smaller bear management units, and the success rate was really low. But it's one form of mortality we can control. Yeah. And particularly once we started figuring out the numbers of grizzly bears are much lower than thought. Well, with the change in status and moratorium in hunting, that probably has allowed some slow rebound in population numbers. Yeah. The Wilmore used to have hunting. It doesn't currently. And, that's where I'm saying, you can get, 20 bears per 1,000 square kilometer or more. So in productive habitats without a lot of human-caused mortality, there would be more. The big question is when you come to a place like Hinton, it's not like it's not a wilderness area, so it's not like we can expect to have very high densities of bears as a target for recovery. Yeah. But we still have to come up with an idea of how do we define recovery of grizzly bears in Alberta?
I love that question.
So it's a threatened status.
Success? Yeah.
Is it 10,000 animals in the province? Is it 5,000? Is it the fact that grizzly bears doubled from roughly 5, a little less than 5 in 2004 to 2014 to about 11 bears per 1,000 square kilometer in the Hinton area. Is that recovery? Mm-hmm. Well, some of the work we're doing could probably suggest that theoretically the landscape without human-caused mortality in a place like Hinton could probably hold double to triple that. So maybe 20 to 30 bears per square kilometer or 1,000 square kilometers. But that's not something that's necessarily should be a target for recovery, because that assumes like a Wilmore Wilderness setting where there's no human activity.
Right.
So the reality is the social carrying capacity is going to have to be somewhere between what we have now and what would be biologically feasible with no human activity.
Of course.
Then the idea is to take those numbers and say, well, essentially bracket with some confidence intervals and say, well, roughly these are biologically attainable recovery targets for a place like Yellowhead or other places in Alberta. Other places in Alberta, like the Grand Cache unit that includes the Wilmore, is doing much better. There's a lot more bears in that area, and as well as the Waterton unit right up against Montana,
right?
Which has a lot of challenges because it also has ranching, but it's much more productive actually. This question about productivity of the ecosystem and how many bears it can support. A place like the Waterton area, it naturally can support quite a few animals, and it's better connected to larger sources of other populations in British Columbia and Montana. While a place like Hinton, I often point this out, you have to remember the Hinton or Yellowhead area west of Edmonton, there's a giant ice field between Alberta and British Columbia, not well connected to the larger populations of bears in British Columbia. And that could also be one of the reasons why, the numbers there are a bit lower and haven't rebounded and been compensated through recruitment or dispersal from animals from British Columbia. They'd have to go all the way around the north or the south of the ice fields, and you get some of that, but it's certainly not as well connected as a place like Waterton area or even the Grand Cache. It's not easy. Yeah.
What about bears in because I mean, I think a lot of people think of grizzly bears as a mountain species, kind of period, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been doing this for a while. Yeah. They're historically, like pre-colonization, they were found in the plains all the time, right?
Yep.
And we've just kind of commandeered the plains to the point where they're just not interested anymore for whatever reason, right? Is that true?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. So I mean, that's that's the interesting kind of issue is that we've relegated them to the places where we don't go. Which is essentially the most
really
rugged.
Steep. You guys can go over there.
It's a little bit difficult to grow canola and other things. So those places that we've left, which happen to be the most rugged mountains, are the places that grizzly bears are left. So we naturally think of them as a mountain species, montane species. But the reality is they occupied a large swath of Western North America, including the plains, including the Edmonton area and the big river valleys. And some people would suggest there were even more, the populations were even larger in those areas. It was even better habitat on the plains where they could dig for gophers and find bison carcasses. It was productive. It was productive in a different way, and particularly with bison and other things. Historically, there was plenty of game.
I'm guessing a grizzly bear could probably catch a bison, probably not too bad.
Well, that's a large male. It would be pretty tough. I think
take on a calf.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. When a lot of people, what they have to realize is that most of the time they're trying to predate calves.
Of course.
So bison calves, moose calves, other things. Of course, if there's a mature animal that's vulnerable, winter or something, not for a grizzly bear, but wolves and stuff like that. I mean, it would, those mature animals can be taken down as well. But often, especially the grizzly bears, they kind of specialize. Not all grizzly bears, they're very individualistic, but some grizzly bears really specialize on the 2 or 3 weeks when moose calves are born or elk calves. And they really try to sniff them out and find them. And in some places, and in some places like in Yellowstone, Lamar Valley, they've literally watched, because the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone is very open, and people get their scopes out and just sit there and you can literally watch a bison and grizzly bears and so on. They've literally watched bison, almost like nose to the ground like a dog, sniffing through the shrubs and the hillsides, and then pouncing on a bison calf.
Yeah.
And the cow was hanging around a bit, and they kind of knew, well, this is,
they know what's up.
So, but a few weeks later, they're not after that cow. They're not after the bull bison. So
they're really opportunists.
They're opportunistic. Yeah. Exactly. And earlier in the spring as well, that's one of the things is they, some people, if you put a collar on a bear, they move a lot, especially in the spring. Mm-hmm. Well, the more you move, the more likely you bump into something opportunistically, like even a winter kill, a carcass from something, or even a wolf kill, and you commandeer the wolf kill. Or if you stay too stationary, your opportunities are actually restricted. Right. So from a foraging perspective, until things become concentrated, like when fruit ripens, you're better off kind of wandering around and hoping you bump into something.
Gotcha.
So
that totally makes sense. Yeah, it's kind of what I figured is that they were
they're highly mobile, and
yeah, they're not lean like a wolf. They're not made for running. Like, they can run really, really fast when they want to, but probably not for all that long.
Exactly, they wander around a lot, and that's what makes their home range size, their territory sizes so large.
Right.
So.
Yeah, how much ground? Like, I mean, obviously it varies. But if you were to give an average number to how much ground, like let's say a male grizzly bear does in a year, how much ground do they cover?
Well, I don't know the actual statistic for the total movement, but I would tell you that depending on how you make a home range.
Sure, let's say home range, yeah.
The home range size for some males can be in something that's called a minimum convex polygon that takes the outside of all the locations, can be 1,000 square kilometers. For some males. Now, females can be much smaller, like 300 square kilometers. So males will often range 2 to 3 times larger areas than females.
Seems pretty standard across the animal kingdom for the most part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the males are larger, and there's usually a correlation between body size and range size. Males are bigger. Well, you'd almost expect them to have bigger home range sizes.
And just for like genetic, breeding purposes and all that
breeding
stuff.
purposes. And
that's kind of what I always attributed it to, was for breeding, but I have no idea.
Well, there is a relationship to that for sure. But it's also the body size just from energetics, kind of coming. You have to have a larger amount of habitat to sustain that size of a body.
Oh, okay.
While a female, if you're a little bit smaller body size, there's actually some trade-offs where they can get away with actually being a little more vegetarian in some instances, and less ungulates or meat composition in their diet, and they can maintain a smaller territory size by being a smaller bear.
Okay.
So their skeletal size can be smaller, and they can still be fat. You want to be fat. Females have to be fat to produce cubs.
Yeah.
But you want to be fat on a smaller frame, on a smaller body size, skeletal length or body size than in areas that have lower productivity of ecosystems. So you'll see that you'll see coastal Alaska, like Kodiak bears, way, way bigger than our Alberta bears. Yeah. Well, they could sustain that because of the food supply. And
just food supply. Yeah, that makes sense. And they're the same species, technically.
Same species, yep. So one thing that folks might not realize is that we call them grizzly bears in North America, but elsewhere in the world they're called brown bears.
Yeah.
And historically, people split the species up. And even there was one fellow in the early 1900s who actually split up North American grizzly bears into 110 different subspecies. He literally had the Swan Hills of Alberta as one species.
Really?
The Canadian Rocky Mountain grizzly bears as another.
Oh my God.
The prairie grizzly bears that were extirpated, lost as another. And then, he just kept splitting Arizona grizzly bear and all these things. But today we literally recognize one species across the northern hemisphere of the world.
Yeah.
So in Scandinavia, Russia, Mongolia, the Alps in Europe and places like that they refer to them as brown bears, exactly the same species as our grizzly bears.
Okay. Yeah. Just like slightly different habitats, slightly different, just
because
location. Right?
Yeah, location. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, because they're a generalist species, they have a wide diversity of foraging approaches and food items. So, everything from more of the vegetarian herbaceous items like cow parsnip and dandelions and clover and so on, to roots that they dig. Well, here they dig Hedysarum alpinum, this alpine sweet vetch.
Oh yeah.
But in which occurs especially in the valleys and the mountains and the alpine and stuff, even in the Edmonton River Valley. But in other places of the world, they just dig a different root.
Yeah,
a corm or a root that has high amounts of carbohydrates and energy that they can get out of it. And then they forage on insects like ant larvae and things like that. Well, you can find those all over the world, and then you could swap any ungulate out as far as the calves or opportunistically some of the mature animals or even winter kills and things like that. So their diet is diverse enough that they can be found, almost in any habitat in the northern hemisphere, at least historically, but have been extirpated from primarily the prairies, the grasslands, and all the places that humans have.
It's for us, because of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the only real reason. Is that that's fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was, during settlement period, obviously carnivores in general were persecuted, if you want to think of it that way. If you're a carnivore, certainly, right? So for good reason. I mean, if you had sheep and you had some cattle and other things, and that was your livelihood, well, of course you're going to protect that livelihood. And then the change in habitats, agriculture and so on has converted the landscapes and removal of bison and those type of things have all meant habitat loss. There's habitat loss, and then what we'd often refer to as overkill. That is, there's more animals being removed than can come back in, and obviously eventually they're going to be extirpated or lost from those places. So, in North America, a lot of folks may not realize there was grizzly bears down in Mexico. Arizona, the foothills and the mountains of Arizona. So they were literally eating acorns and oak trees and things like that. And
it's pretty dry down there. There must have been smaller sized bears.
Exactly. Yeah, smaller bears and low densities. And no wonder why
we're learning stuff.
No wonder why. No wonder why they were lost first, right? Because especially being extremely low densities, it made them even more vulnerable. And then when folks brought in cattle and various things into the foothills and mountains of Arizona, and they weren't down in the actual desert; they're more in the hills and the mountains. But so a wide diversity of habitat, a generalist. Having said that, they definitely tend to prefer slightly more open habitats, but near forests. So it's the forest edges and openings, and even the grasslands of North America were all important habitat. And it turns out if you go too much into the boreal forest, especially the Canadian Shield, historically, grizzly bears actually did not occupy that area, and that was dominated by black bears.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because you go up there, is there black bears in like Northwest Territories, like way up north? I know there's grizzly bears.
Yeah,
up there.
I mean, the black bear range is quite extensive, almost everywhere. So it's almost to the point where they overlap almost all of grizzly bear range. Maybe not in the far north. There's some places they don't.
Yeah.
By the time you get into the Arctic areas of far northern Northwest Territories and stuff, you actually have grizzly bears, but no black bears. But the rest of the area, they're almost all overlap.
Yeah.
And some people have suggested one of the reasons why maybe grizzly bears haven't historically occupied the parts of the boreal forest like northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, and places like that is because there's too much competition with black bears. And the one interesting observation is in Scandinavia, where you have the same kind of Canadian Shield, low productivity boreal forest.
Yep.
They have no black bears there.
Okay.
But they have brown bears. They have grizzly bears.
Did they have black bears?
No.
Oh, they never did?
No.
So as far as we know.
So So habitat-wise, their brown bears can occupy that niche when no black bears are there.
Right.
But in North America, there's places that black bears can go almost everywhere grizzly bears can go. But there's places that grizzly bears can't maintain populations that black bears can sustain. And so the thought is, well, remember I was talking before about you can be a smaller body size and you can kind of get by with lower quality habitat.
Oh, I see.
A black bear is a lot smaller body size.
Yeah, no kidding.
So from that standpoint, that's kind of the general idea. It's obviously a very difficult thing to test to know for sure, but just some people trying to kind of think of the distribution, the biogeography of bears in general.
Yeah,
and what limits them.
Yeah. Oh no, for sure.
Yeah.
What is it about open or like forest edges and open kind of spaces that is better for grizzly bears?
Well, that's a good question.
Bears.
I mean, it's in one sense it kind of depends, but in one sense there often can be better productivity of the type of food items that grizzly bears are into, particularly things like root digging. So if you imagine the claws on the front claws are much longer on a grizzly bear, and that is literally designed for digging.
Right.
Well, if you're in the Canadian Shield, you aren't going to dig very far into the rock.
Yeah, no.
And there's probably not as many kind of corms and roots that they can take advantage and so on. So right away you can see, whoa, they're really evolved for, they're adapted for digging and digging rodents and gophers and things like this and roots and things like that. So right away you think you can see that kind of co-adaptation of the type of habitats or environments that they would do well in.
Yeah.
And then a black bear, its claws and stuff are really designed for climbing trees, not root digging and things like this. So it just slightly different adaptations that kind of promote more open and forest edge habitats.
Sure.
for grizzly bears, while, kind of pure forested environments, black bears do better in.
Gotcha.
Particularly if there's brown bears around, because the black bear needs to climb a tree to get away from the grizzly bear, basically.
That's what I was just, when you said that, I never really thought of what
very fast.
Yeah, that's what. Well, why would black bears need to climb trees? Would it just be to get away from grizzly bears, or for the cubs
other
to
predators
get away,
too? Yeah. The cubs in particular. It could be wolves, it could be coyotes and stuff, but especially other bears, black bears even, infanticide.
Yeah.
But grizzly bears where they co-occur, and wolves.
Yeah.
So it's an adaptation for them in danger to get away, particularly when they're more vulnerable, like a yearling or cub.
Right.
That
is an amazing thing. The fact, I don't think people understand how common it is for like infanticide, right? For the cannibalism or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Like it's super common among bears, right?
Well, I wouldn't call it common. I mean, it's even controversial about how common it is, but I think it's well known in other carnivore species, lions and so on. And there was some controversy early on about whether some of that was the big question is, it's known that there have been brown bears or grizzly bears that have killed cubs. That are usually other males, but some people have suggested, well, that's just an opportunity for food.
Sure,
that was the idea. Well, the true, which would be kind of the bigger issue is if it was infanticide through the mechanism of trying to gain access to the female to mate with her, then the killing of the cub by a different male would be not necessarily for a food resource, a food item, but rather to put the female back in to breed with her again. So she loses her cubs, she'll right away breed again. So if you're a big grizzly bear and you didn't sire those cubs, you don't want to wait. Remember I told you how long it is before she's available in her birth interval between cubs?
Yeah.
You don't want to wait 3 or 4 years. Yeah. You want to wait 1 month
or
a few weeks. So you kill the cubs, she will go back into estrus and you can breed with her and so that's that was a bit controversial for a while, but the Scandinavians have, for the most part, shown that is the case. They have like video evidence and they've tried to look at this question in detail to show that even when some of the males were killing the cubs, they actually weren't even eating them. Oh, they were then immediately following the female.
So it was infanticide. It wasn't just
exactly. So, but how common that is, I wouldn't call it like real common.
Sure.
It happens.
Okay.
And one of the ideas is if you remove like the largest males from the population who probably sired all these cubs because they'll breed with many females, the moderate sized males will come in. And if there isn't another older male there to kind of protect, which it really isn't the case anyway. It's not like the older male keeps following around the female all the time with the cubs.
They're not fathers,
but
really.
they wander around, and if there's a big guy that the others are bumping into, they're a bit more cautious. But if they can sneak in there, either if that male was killed, hunting, poaching, or other means, then it's kind of fair game everywhere. And so that's kind of known in lions. Like if the big guy gets killed somehow, then the next top dog is basically going to go around and kill all the kittens. That's and crazy. Breed with
Could you imagine though only be able to get the lead out once every 6 years? I mean, I might kill somebody too. That's gonna be a lot of frustration in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Poor guys.
Well, females know what are smart as well. I mean, their adaptation is to breed with as many males as possible.
Yeah.
And then the idea is you mix paternity. You don't know who the father is. In fact, there are cases where if you look at the genetics of 2 cubs, they can be from different fathers.
Oh, really?
Not always, but it has been shown.
Possible.
It's possible. And so she's breeding with many males, and by mixing the paternity, I think that's my cub. I bred with her, but you wouldn't know.
No, yeah.
And that's her counter strategy.
Gotcha.
But if a new male moved in, knew it didn't breed with that female, and then there's some cubs there, well, your best strategy is that individual male is infanticide, to kill the cubs and to try to promote your genes by breeding. Right?
That's bananas, man. Like this, it's crazy to think, but
I wouldn't call it super common. It just happens. Probably less so in grizzly bears, brown bears than even lions and stuff, but other species. But it's certainly present.
Okay. Yeah. And so it sounds like there isn't really like some of your papers that you had written or you had co-authored, we're talking about trying to find like priority areas for protection for grizzly bear habitat.
Yeah.
Is there is there priority areas like kind of in Alberta to and like where are they?
Yeah.
And then let's start with
Sure.
that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So what we've done over time is like originally for my PhD between 2000 2005, the primary task I had, besides kind of learning more about the actual ecology of brown bears in Alberta, grizzly bears in Alberta, was also a very applied question. The applied question is, let's map grizzly bear habitat, the best habitats that are there, based on the type of things bears actually use. So the GPS collar data on where they went, and they really like these riparian areas, they really like these forest edges, these certain age clear cuts. All those things went into some mapping and models that created maps that said good, mediocre, poor habitat.
Okay.
And those maps I then used to kind of use in a conservation planning perspective to say where are the clustering, the larger landscape scale of best habitats.
Yep.
And where are road densities as low as possible. So we usually use roads or road density as a surrogate for human activity. So we can't really directly measure how many people are using what.
Sure.
And we just know that more roads means more access, means more likely that people are going to bump into a grizzly bear. In a very few instances, some of those interactions may be negative for the grizzly bear, mortality, poaching, or so on. Some instances may be the other way around, where people are attacked by the grizzly bear. Right. But the point is if you separate people from bears and make it a lot harder to get into the best bear habitat, they're more likely to be kind of sustainable, high priority areas for conservation for grizzly bears.
It's similar to like caribou habitat in that sort of way. Hey, like it just seems they're just kind of opposed to human activity.
Yeah. Well, no, this is the interesting thing. That's what I think a lot of people think, but it's there's kind of two mechanisms going on for grizzly bears. The one is the mortality, that I call it the top-down effect. That is what's affecting survival of grizzly bears. Well, it's there's a little bit of infanticide and those type of things, but it's generally human-caused mortality. And we can usually sustain a certain amount of that, but when the populations are low, we can't sustain much of that.
Yeah.
And human activity like forestry and oil and gas and so on has increased the road network a bit.
Absolutely.
And that has caused a lot, right? And that has caused more and more people to, be in those habitats that obviously 50 years ago, if you went to Hinton and tried to drive south towards Nordegg, it'd be pretty tough to do 50 years ago. It'd take you a long time, and you would only have maybe one road. Maybe, I don't even know if the Forestry Trunk Road was done then.
I'm not sure when it came in.
Anyway, so there weren't many people back there accessing those areas. So there's that side of it. But the for grizzly bears, the bottom up side is the productivity of the habitat. And it turns out, as I've been hinting at, that more open habitats, forest edges, actually boost productivity of the habitats and actually increase, things like, body size and local density of bears.
Yeah.
So actually forestry can really actually be it can be a positive on the bottom up side. And if they control the road issue, overall could be a positive effect. If they don't control the road issue, then it could equalize. It could be a little bit negative because roads, the effect of mortalities is just too much, even if you increase productivity. So from grizzly bears, I think of it as pretty, it'd be a lot easier to recover grizzly bears than caribou. The flip on caribou is, if you disturb their habitat, it doesn't get better. Like for grizzly bears, more disturbance is better, whether it be fire or clear cuts or whatever. From the bottom up side. From the bottom up side of caribou, their forage and things like that are, for instance, in the winter, it's lichen, ground lichens, and in the mountains, it's arboreal or tree lichens.
Yeah.
But if you have fires or other disturbances, it takes roughly 40 years to recover lichens.
Yeah.
And for grizzly bears, a lot of their habitat and the food items actually can peak, 5 to 15 years after a disturbance. So if you have a lot of patchy disturbances, it actually is even better for grizzly bears.
Yeah.
And we also know that we can just look at different places in the world that have gone through what Alberta has gone through, and Sweden is probably the best kind of example to think of, analogy. And they persecuted their brown bears or grizzly bears for even longer, hundreds and hundreds of years. They even had laws like in the 17 and 1600s, thou shall kill any wolf or bear that comes.
They just saw them as monsters.
Yeah, kind of thing, right? So, and they did a good job, but in Sweden the numbers went down to roughly about 500 bears.
Oh, okay.
By about 1900.
Oh wow.
Or the late 1800s.
How much of that was it just because they saw them as monsters, or was it fur trade and stuff like that?
Well, I think it was a combination of both. I mean, they took advantage of both, but anywhere there was some human settlements, they tried to extirpate them locally. Mm-hmm. And remember, we're down to about 750 in the province, right?
Yeah.
Fast forward from 1900 to 2000, or today, they have 3,000. Right. Yet they have more people than they had in 1900. They have more roads, more forestry, more everything. So, but what they have is they have a little bit different culture of, they have a very, strict regulated hunting.
Right.
But they regulate that to make sure that they didn't bring back hunting until they had fairly large numbers that could sustain it.
Oh, so they are hunting.
They're hunting them now.
There.
Yeah.
Oh,
and they're still sustaining 3,000 in a landscape with a lot of roads and a landscape with a lot of forestry. Huh. It just demonstrates that if you give it enough time, it can be win-win from the standpoint of from the forestry standpoint, which is an interesting conservation scenario of, for grizzly bears being a generalist, actually more forest edge, more of this, as long as you control that top-down issue.
Right.
For caribou, No, if you disturb the bottom or you have the top, you have a problem both ways.
For sure.
And anything that increases, especially early cereal forests for caribou, will increase deer and moose, which increase wolves.
Yeah.
And then
because a bunch of problems.
And the similarity between caribou and grizzly bears is their low fecundity. That's what makes them similar and vulnerable. That is, the caribou are not white-tailed deer. They're not cranking out two fawns every year, or calves kind of thing every year. It takes a while, and just that, by taking multiple years between calves, and sometimes only having one and not two, and often just one, and that kind of thing. They're low fecundity, low reproductive rates, so that makes them vulnerable to wolf predation, to any source of mortality.
No, is it? I just had a weird thought about human fecundity, and I'm like, oh man, what if there's anybody managing us that's like, their fecundity is it's like every 30 years they have a kid.
No, we're 7 billion people, but eventually there'll be a transition. People talk about that, like demographers. There's a lot of people, and there'll still be more, but through education and development of third world or developing countries, number of children will reduce per family dramatically. And then there will be this natural transition that essentially sustains a number that people don't know
already.
Yeah, it's heading in that direction. Yeah. So it's not. We still have an awful lot of people, and each person needs a lot of resource. Mm-hmm. So this is still a major issue.
Oh, for sure.
And obviously, if you add even more people, it's even a bigger issue. But it can't go exponentially forever. No. And there would be, obviously some other issues, disease or something else. But even we're going to have a natural demographic transition in the next number of decades.
Something's got to give eventually. Yeah, for sure. It just can't keep going forever. Yeah.
And then we lose habitat for our species that we like, and so on and stuff. So to me, it's an issue. I mean, it'd be nice to, the more people we have, obviously everybody needs resources, and it'd be awfully nice, at least for myself, to have opportunities to go to wilderness areas and view wildlife and so on. And so it's obviously the big conservation challenge we're dealing with.
That's a whole nother.
We're losing our big carnivores. We're losing.
Sure.
We're losing those things I just described. There's going to be winners and losers. The losers are the things with low reproductive rates, large territory sizes, low densities. Oh, that's our lions and grizzly bears but I just gave an example of Sweden. There are a few instances where it could be win-win.
Yeah, but everyone has to be on the same page, right?
You have to be on the same. Yep,
that's the major problem here. I think is everybody feels like, well, this is public forest. I can do what I want. And it's like, well, sure, it's your forest.
Yeah.
I like doing that every now and again.
Exactly.
But it's also everyone else's forest too.
Yeah.
So that's where the management comes in. And so it's interesting when you have people that want to like random camping in the middle of the bush, right? Like I love doing that. It's great. That's what I do when I'm hunting. That's what I do. And I love it. It's awesome. But also I recognize that in places like the mountain regions, those are really sensitive areas, and you got 2 million people or 3 million people right next to it. They're going there every weekend. Like you have a huge impact.
Yeah.
and it's not good. So we have to be regulating that somehow. But people get pissed, right? Like
no, I could see it. I mean, there's a tradition. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? I mean, I grew up going to wilderness canoeing in the Boundary Waters Wilderness Area and Quetico Wilderness Area in Ontario.
Yeah.
And I always wanted to go to Quetico. You know why? They let in 1/10 as many people, and they let you camp anywhere.
Yeah.
In the Boundary Waters, they let in a lot more people, and they still have to cut off the number of people. But you were told, well, there were campsites that you could camp at a campsite, first come first serve, but you could not camp outside of a campsite.
Oh, okay, so it's
So anyway, I mean, it's but the model is Quetico could only do that by reducing the total number of people.
Yeah.
And the issue is, it'd be great, but if we literally had, the metropolitan areas of Calgary and Edmonton all accessing every weekend, that's just too many. So
it's done.
At some point in time, there probably has to be some level of regulation when there's too many people trying to use the same resource. So
I'm all for the regulation when it comes to that kind of stuff, because I mean, it's just because you were able to do something when you were a kid, whatever, 30, 40, 50 years ago, doesn't mean. Just because something's tradition doesn't mean you get to keep doing it. Yeah. That's not a reason for doing something. The science needs to be backed up. Sure. It needs to be sustainable.
In their
future, I like what's you might remember this. Teddy Roosevelt had that quote about managing for future generations. Or whatever. Do you remember it?
Yeah. Well, I can't quote it directly, but I know where you're going.
Yeah, it was something about like we're not managing, or we're not conserving the land for our children or our children's children, but for generations still trapped in the womb of time.
Yeah.
Or something like that. It's something that's just like, ooh, I like that. It's good. It's a good way to put it. You're like, we're cheating by allowing too many people, we're cheating future generations out of that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so anyways, we're getting off track.
Well, no, I mean, it does come into land use planning and other things. There should still be opportunities for that type of camping, but it's usually we call them wilderness areas.
Yeah.
So we usually move them away from the roads. So if it's near a road and it's unregulated, well, then anybody can camp along any stream along the foothills of Alberta, and it just gets to be a little too much.
For sure. Anyways, back to priority areas for grizzly bears.
Yes.
So what does the data suggest is good priority areas for grizzly bears that should be quote unquote protected, and not like are those areas like that, or are those areas, can they be working landscapes as well, or do you think there's areas that need to be designated that aren't designated now as like protected grizzly bear areas?
Well, I think if it was caribou, I'd have a different answer. I'd be more inclined to actually more formal protection. But as I've described, I think there are possibilities that with the right management, you could have working landscapes with grizzly bears. But the way we think of it is we think of way more sharing of roads between industry, way fewer roads overall, road access management. So maybe gating doesn't always work and so on, but
rolling back roads,
and, especially this may also align with the current paradigm in forest management with natural disturbance-based forestry, the very large clear cuts. Before with two-pass forestry, you kind of had to go back, 15 years later after green up or whatever, and cut the adjacent and then the adjacent and so on. And so you kind of wanted to leave your roads open. But if you're doing these much larger harvest blocks with some retention patchiness in the edges, the forest edges that grizzly bears like, you roll back those roads right away, so you don't have to go back in there for many, 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 many decades till the next rotation.
Well, that's
then I don't see as big of a deal.
Sure.
But that's for grizzly bears. I mean, I could easily, you could find a different old growth forest specialist species, and
that's just grizzly bears. Exactly. We're not talking about for everything. This is just grizzly bears, and then we have to find the information for caribou, find the information for whatever the dust mite is that we need to protect or whatever. So it's complicated. I get it, but I'm just trying to.
Yeah. But for Albertans, as compared to, let's say, Sweden, so they went, I'd say we still have a bit of our pioneering attitudes as far as carnivores and other things, and I think that we'll eventually transition through that, so it'll be somewhat similar to Sweden in the long run. At least I would hope. That's my
I would love that.
my vision of, at least my hope of where we'd go with conservation of grizzly bears. I think we give them enough room, we manage it smart, and we change some of the attitudes towards people and bears.
Yep.
In the long term, I think it could work.
Okay. I want to get back to attitudes. I want to get back to there eventually. But while we're on this vein of management, So we're talking about management of not just grizzly bears, but like a working landscape with grizzly bears on it and changing the way we do things, right? Whether that's oil and gas or forestry or whatever. What are like your suggestions as somebody who's looked at the data and you've tried to sort out how we can change this, right? And like you said, I think the current paradigm in forestry is that a lot of, I won't say all, but a lot of the forestry companies they recognize that it's good for everybody, including themselves, to roll back access roads if they're not planning on being back there right away, right? If they got 10, 15, 20, 30 years before they're going back, roll them back. And you know what I mean? You can harvest what comes back in the interim. But not everyone does that. Sometimes they just they just pull ditches across them.
Sure.
And you can't get your truck down there, but a quad has no problem. So the access issue is still a problem. But anyways, so key thing, I guess, is that you were saying that forestry, at least anyways, can be okay for grizzly bears as long as the roads are pulled out. The access is the main issue.
As long as you control access of people, of humans. So I think, to me, I think of it in two kind of levers, and one's short-term, one's long-term. The short-term lever is access management, rolling back roads. Maybe if you have to have a road there, gating it, limiting access. And then the long-term approach is education and attitudes towards bears
for public.
For the public. Because I just described a scenario where Sweden has a lot of bears and a lot of roads.
Yeah.
Because it's not the roads that kill bears, and people will point that out. Well, it's not the roads. No, it's not. It's the people on the roads.
Yeah.
And it's a very small proportion of the people who have those attitudes who kind of ruin it for everyone else. If that's the kind of idea, right?
Always the case.
It's always the case.
Yeah.
So. If we have no choice, then I guess it's like, unfortunately, everyone else is disadvantaged by, minimizing access.
A few assholes are going to screw it up for everybody. That's always what happens. But name a situation, right? It's always the assholes that screw it up for the rest of us.
A colleague of mine called it the knucklehead factor. There's always a knucklehead who kind of ruins it for everyone else. Anyway, that's what we're dealing with in the short term. And in the long term, if we have fewer knuckleheads, generally our attitudes towards bears are more around coexistence.
Yeah.
And we'll have larger population size. We can have hunting again.
Yeah.
Like Sweden, and you could still literally have forestry.
Yeah.
It's caribou and things like that are a different issue, but for grizzly bears, this is the thing. For grizzly bears, I'm like, this is an easy win for conservation if we did this. It's not that hard. Caribou is hard.
Right.
Grizzly bears is easy.
Okay.
I think of it as. I mean, nothing's easy, but I mean, relatively speaking, compared to the caribou conundrum.
Yeah.
Grizzly bears are kind of just waiting there to be a success story.
So cut blocks, let's explain. Yeah. So you just for people who aren't baptized in forestry and don't understand what we're talking about when it comes to natural disturbance-based forestry versus like two-pass forestry and that kind of stuff. Just explain the differences there real quick and why the new paradigm is better than the old paradigm.
Yeah. Well, we've looked at this question in a number of different ways, but kind of at the broadest perspective, the two different paradigms or approaches in forestry were historically in environmentalism and conservation. There was a push to have smaller clear cuts rather than massive big openings. Yeah. And industry responded, and regulation in Alberta say clear cuts shall not be larger than X size, and I don't know the actual size limit.
I don't remember either.
And but it ended up, and then the second part of that was don't be too large. Wait for that to green up to a green up rule of roughly 3 meters or more of trees that were planted or natural regeneration. Then you can harvest the adjacent patch of forest, and then on and on. So it ended up looking like a checkerboard.
It literally looks like a checkerboard.
It literally looks like a checkerboard.
If you go on Google Maps or Google Earth and scan through northern Alberta, you can see from a long ways up, you can see checkerboard patterns.
You can see checkerboard. You can see harvested, not harvested, harvested, not harvested. So it was this checkerboard.
Which was done, first of all, before we move on, that was done out of the thought that was the best for conservation and forestry. And it was thought of being as, this is what we can do to be good stewards of the land.
Exactly.
Period.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
it looks dumb from the air, but it's that was the idea at the time.
That was the idea. And from a grizzly bear standpoint, that the mosaic of patches and the forest edges actually is a pretty decent thing. That's not the issue.
Yeah.
The bigger issue in that management approach or that planning approach for how you're harvesting the trees, the volume of trees, is the road network associated with it had to be maintained more because you were coming back and harvesting the other checkerboard part of it, the black squares or the white squares or whatever. And so you maintain a more open roads. And the idea was it also did not match the natural disturbance regime of Alberta, and that is wildfires. Of course, you have small canopy gap dynamics, like from insects and other things, and wind and ice and so on. But for the most part, the dominant disturbance regime is wildfire.
Of course.
And wildfires were large, not small little patches. And inside the wildfire perimeter, there usually was highly variable in its fire intensity or severity of actually leaving residual unburned patches of trees.
Yeah.
So the conservationists were, people like Jerry Franklin in Washington, a scientist there, a forest ecologist there, it started moving by the 1980s towards suggesting natural disturbance-based forestry. And it became a little more popular in the discussion in the 1990s, and including in Alberta with some experiments like the EMEND experiment in Northwest Alberta, where let's try it. Let's have larger clear cuts. Well, they're actually not clear cuts anymore. Larger harvests, blocks, and inside there leave residual amounts of trees, either in large patches or in scattered small patches. And then from the air and from the distance as it's regenerating, it almost looks like a fire. It looks more natural.
Looks less like people went and drew straight lines in the bush.
Yeah. And my perspective from grizzly bears is overall, it's not like there's that much difference in the habitat supply for bears, but you could manage roads differently, which would be a big benefit.
Okay.
And actually, the one place where there actually could be a little bit better increase in habitat quality for grizzly bears is, like you said, they're not these straight edges. There actually is a lot of wavy edges. It actually increases total forest edge.
Of course. Yeah.
And for grizzly bears, I just described a few minutes ago, are an edge specialist. They like openings. They like the adjacent forest. And it turns out the edges, we've done studies and have demonstrated the edges also they're more productive in food supply.
Yeah.
The edges into the forest, there's more light penetration. So you have greater fruit production in buffaloberry and blueberry and huckleberry.
Yeah.
And just on the inside of the edge and the opening side, you have better productivity of like the raspberries and some of the herbaceous species, the dandelions and clover and things like that they favor and stuff. So it's almost like more edges better for grizzly bears. And the interesting part about that is that kind of goes back to one of the founder of wildlife management, wildlife ecology in North America was Aldo Leopold in the 1930s, and the first professor of wildlife management in the United States, in North America. And his whole perspective on managing game was edge.
Yeah.
He's like, the more he definitely said no habitat loss. You don't want habitat loss, but the more you can have highly variable habitats and forest edges up against openings, he demonstrated you can increase the general game.
For sure.
And so his textbook was game management.
Right.
How do you increase game management? By increasing edges.
Yeah.
But as we moved to the 1960s and 70s, as people started worrying more about old growth specialists like spotted owls and certain warbler or other songbird species that are adapted to old growth, we've moved away from that paradigm of you actually want a lot of edges to a lot fewer edges.
Fire suppression played a role
there
too.
Fire suppression and so on, and especially in the foothills of Alberta. Boreal is burning quite a bit more now, but the foothills are still fire suppressed, and including the montane areas of the mountains. So
it's pretty homogeneous out there.
And when I first started my PhD, we were trapping down near the Cardinal River south of Hinton, about an hour south of Hinton, and we to get to the place where we had camp set up and we were trapping, it was 120-year-old lodgepole pine forest for as far as the eye could see.
Yeah.
And you walked under there, and extremely low productivity of habitat for things like grizzly bears. And guess what? We couldn't catch a grizzly bear down there for our life. They're just, and this is where, it needed a fire. And if there was no fire, well, the surrogate of fire is going to be harvesting trees. And there has been more harvesting. And coincidentally, there's actually a bit more bears down there now.
Interesting.
That early semi-open forest edges promote bears.
It's breaking it up. Yeah. There's not like there's those old lodgepole pine, strict lodgepole pine forests. They're not there's not a whole lot of shrubs under there. A
No,
lot of
the
times.
understory is often dominated by bryophytes.
Yeah.
And a few alder shrubs here or there. And it's not good habitat
Maybe some blueberry,
for the type of
huckleberry,
game species we're talking about. Of course, you can probably find an old growth specialist songbird that's well adapted to
I'm
that.
sure there
so
is.
that's the trade-off. That's why I was saying there's winners and losers.
Totally.
And it depends on what you're managing.
Well, that's just it, right? That's the interest of this entire every single episode I've ever done of this podcast. I'm edging towards that idea of like, how do we create like a matrix decision tool that's like, okay, we're going to input all the information that we know about grizzly bears, everything we know about all of the at-risk bird species, all of the whatever insect species, and okay, let's create this, and then like let's weigh it all out, and what's the best decision for it. It's all so crazy complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated, isn't it? But the way I think of it is, we've the foresters have done really good in essentially optimizing and finding ways to allocate timber volume for a mill. And I think it's a matter of bringing in these other things as constraints.
Yep.
And if you have a large enough landscape, that's the key. I mean, if you have too small of a landscape, well, how are you possibly going to get all those resources? But we're kind of lucky in Alberta. We have very large landscapes, green zone, crown land.
Yeah.
And if we're smart about it, we probably can kind of optimize for a few different things. And,
absolutely.
And these constraints of leave habitat here, and in some places, well, actually for grizzly bears, it's a bit of a win-win. As long as we control roads, we can actually do the harvesting and maintain or increase habitat supply. We just have to control the top-down, the mortality side. Yeah. Okay, there, caribou, we better leave the peatland area here or there. And anyway, so it's it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off between the resources we use and need. Yeah. And the wildlife we all want. I don't think there's very few people who don't want wildlife.
No.
So it's not like
sure. Nobody's like, goddamn, caribou will kill them all, or like, there's some people actually. I've heard that. Yeah. but not people in the industry, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
So that's the fun part, though.
We need large landscapes to do this, though.
Of course, and luckily we have them, right? Yeah. And it's just a matter of controlling our own interests with the interests of everything else out there, right?
And planning at these very large scales.
Totally.
Yeah. So those long-term harvest plans, those are crucial to kind of leave for caribou, leave for that, or be really restrictive in how you're managing those roads. And that's what, if we come back to that priority areas, so that analysis I did on prioritization of places that are the most important, we call them core habitat for grizzly bears.
Yep.
Well, that's where we were saying, here is where, I suppose we're not saying you can't have your resource. We're just saying, keep the road density network to lower than this threshold.
Right.
And originally we said 0.6 kilometers per square kilometer of road.
Okay.
And more recent research by my colleague John Boulanger and Gordon Stenhouse did a survival estimate of bears according to road density and showed that it's actually closer to about 0.5 kilometers per square kilometer. So it's even... The reason it's a little bit different is we didn't know what the relationship between road density and survival was. We knew it was negative. That is, as you got more roads, you had lower survival. Right. But we didn't know the actual curve until many, 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 many years into the study, with many bears collared, and takes a while for to build up a database of dead bears to get survival estimates. So we used other metrics from the United States. It included like Yellowstone National Park, where they had, or outside of Yellowstone, which said the U.S. Forest Service was going to limit to 0.6 kilometers per square kilometer. So we just used that. But it turns out it's a little more productive down there, right? The more productive it is, the more the carrying capacity and the reproductive rates are higher and everything. You could probably sustain, more roads and so on. And so, we just had a slight decrease in Alberta to 0.5 is really the threshold. So the idea is these areas that are already good for bears already have low density of roads. We just want to maintain that or keep it at that threshold. Okay. And so to me, it doesn't even necessarily say no more roads, new roads. To me, I think of it as a management opportunity for balancing, things in conservation, including restoration. So reclaim the road that's aren't used and build that extra kilometer you need, so it could be done that way for sure to maintain it below some threshold. So that could be a way of still getting access to the resources while still being bear friendly in that context. Yep.
That makes sense. What about the relationship with like oil and gas exploration, that kind of stuff? Like, they've changed the way that they do things now too. I mean, it used to be, you'd have 7 parallel cut lines
Yeah.
within a couple
Yeah.
hundred meters of each other. And I mean, they do the low impact seismic and stuff. And like if you don't know what's there, you're not going to see it type thing. Right.
Yeah.
And unless you're really paying attention, you might run but it's so, how has the way that they've changed the way they do things, has that been a net positive, or is there still more? Like what could be done from their perspective to help be more bear friendly? And, you know what I mean?
Well, I mean that from the habitat side of things, the seismic lines, the exploration, and those things weren't that big a deal unless those seismic lines became ATV trails. So it turns out,
again. Just all people
it comes
again.
back to access to people. So the more they can switch, move towards a low impact seismic, or really any seismic line that makes it very difficult to create a human access point of ATVs, then from the grizzly bear standpoint, it's not going to be a problem.
Okay.
But it is a problem for those especially those legacy disturbances. We often call them 2D seismic lines that are spread out wider, every 500 meters or thereabouts in some places. But they were wider. They were done earlier. They generally had people started using them, and they've been this legacy access for
there's no reclamation
hunting,
there.
trapping, and very on. There was no reclamation rules, and so on. So I like the idea of them moving towards complete zero impact seismic line where there's no cutting of trees at all.
Yeah.
Which is a great new innovation, and I think overall for the other species, especially in the boreal forests that are even more sensitive, and caribou and those type of issues, that's the way
There's
forward.
more to worry about than just bears, for sure.
Yep. And the problem is we still have a legacy of hundreds of thousands of kilometers of seismic lines.
Yeah.
Some of them are regenerating on their own.
Yeah.
A lot of them aren't. And it's literally $1 billion issue of if you're truly trying to restore or reclaim them.
Oh, totally.
It's expensive.
That's a question I've been trying to get someone to talk about, actually. And there's a woman I'll talk after, the woman at the university that we've been talking to. But I wanted to ask about exactly that question. Like, what is success when it comes to reclamation? Right? Like, so if you're reclaiming a seismic line, is it okay that it comes back to like a super dense alder?
Yeah.
So there's no access anymore.
Sure.
Is that reclaimed? It's not what it used to be.
Sure.
But reclamation is often not what it it used to be. It's
Yeah.
something else, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, we don't have to talk about that. But
Well,
that's a question.
One quick thing is that the way we think of it is, for at least from the caribou issue, is functional restoration versus ecological restoration. And the immediate functional restoration is try to minimize wolf movement into caribou habitat. So alder does just fine.
Does great.
Does it look like the adjacent forest? No. So it's not truly ecological restoration. So ideally, the restoration in the long term would maybe be both. It would look like a forest again. But in the short term, if the question is caribou conservation, then a functional restoration of minimizing movement by having coarse woody debris, trees down, alder growing, any way to make it inaccessible is gonna get that first immediate goal.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. Yeah. It's interesting that for bears at least, it's as simple as just reducing road.
That's why it's
people out of there. Like it's
they're generalists. They use all the habitats. It's not like there's this one habitat that's super highly specialized. No. And the other flip side is not only the generalists using many different habitats, but they actually prefer the early cereal forest environments.
Right.
Well, that's a good thing for if you're in a landscape that's highly modified.
Yeah.
The only issue is from the forestry standpoint is the silviculturalists are too good.
Oh,
that is,
it's coming back too dense.
They get trees growing too fast.
Yeah.
So remember I said they kind of like that open kind of. Well, you don't have roots like Hedysarum growing underneath lodgepole trees. You have them growing up to the point where the lodgepole trees touch each other. Yeah. So you need light penetration to the ground layer, and we find that in a fire it can take it's really haphazard in how the trees are growing. Some places super super dense, dog hair thick. But other places, a little semi-open. It takes 50 years in some places to actually the crown of the canopy to close. But at least in the foothills and places like the Hinton area, they can get those canopies to close between 15 and 20 years.
Or even less.
Less. And by the time that happens, especially natural regeneration with deciduous species, but as conifer, it lasts a little bit longer for open. But as soon as the canopy closes, the productivity, the habitat value for the grizzly bear crashes.
Right. That makes
So
sense.
it's
That's why they move.
That's why if it's a mosaic of disturbances,
Right.
it's fine, and they have a large enough home range to deal with that.
See, it's funny that you say that about almost too good, because that's what I had Vic Leafers on a while back, and that's exactly what he says, right? He's like this. He's like, honestly, we're to the point where we're too good at it, and I mean that it's we have I say a D density conifer stand at 20 years, but people don't know what that means. It just means that all the crowns are touching and the trees are only 5 meters tall.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
And there's no light penetration. You're like, that doesn't normally happen in a natural succession situation. Right. So they're like, well, what does that mean for habitat and for other things? Right. Well, and for some things, it'll be great for other things. So what,
from a bear's perspective, we've thought about this question quite a bit, and there's two things. One, we would love to see silvicultural thinning to actually increase light penetration again. The problem is the cost issue. In a place like Alberta, it just isn't done. But the rest of the world, it is done.
It sure seems like.
And even although, you can take an eastern deciduous forest where that's the standard, it's individual, tree gap kind of removal, selective harvest of individual trees. But in Scandinavia, where it's boreal forest, they're required by law to do thinning. I don't know. It's like after the first 20 or 25 years, and then they're supposed to do another one before they harvest.
It's very intensely.
And it's intensely managed, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, once the problem is we talked about, the only way to intensely manage is to maintain roads. So we don't really want to do that.
No.
But my point is, it comes back to the light issue and the canopy gaps and openness. Maybe instead we think of these are really productive little microsites or habitats for bears that had the buffalo berry and the blueberry and the huckleberry and these other things. We plant at way lower density there.
Right. And
naturally it'll stay a little more open longer.
Yep.
And that instead of that 15-year window, we can get a 30 or 35-year window out of it or something like that.
For sure.
So.
And I think as far as I've through the grapevine, through talking to people in the industry and stuff like that, it sounds like a lot of mills are looking into doing, some mills have done a lot of thinning in the last decade.
Interesting.
Mostly out of wood supply problems because of large burns that have happened in the FMA and stuff like that, right? But I mean, that still included in all of those planning processes is all the voids that are normally there, right? All the values, all the objectives, all that stuff is still there. But I think it sounds like there's a lot of mills that are looking into doing more of that.
Sure.
So it'll be interesting.
Maybe a future study, a future opportunity for in this case it would be beneficial to grizzly bears. The other two things that I think of that are issues with the silvicultural side of forest management is site prep.
Yeah.
So some types of site preparation that we've looked at, in particular, damages the rhizomes or roots of shrubs.
Like which ones? Martini plow?
No. Blueberry being one of the big ones. So any of the vacciniums, the blueberry and huckleberry.
Yep.
And then to some extent also a buffalo berry.
Okay.
And so those three shrubs are the most important fruiting species for grizzly bears in our province. And the issue is that they do come back, but it takes them a little bit longer to come back after being ripped up a bit and so on. And by the time they're just starting to get going is the time when the canopy closes because they're too good on the flip side of growing trees.
So these are plants that depend for people. So rhizomes are they're plants that even when the top is taken off or browsed or whatever it is, there's a thick, dense root system that's in place in the bottom, and it has so much carbohydrates stored, it just pops back up in no time, and it's still pumping out berries like it's nobody's business.
And it only take a couple of years to pump out berries again, especially in a normal surface disturbance. But if the rhizomes or roots are disturbed, then they'll still come back, but they'll come back way, way, way slower.
Yeah, it's harder.
And it's harder. And then by the time they're just getting back, boom, the canopy closes.
Yeah.
The third issue, so it's like growing trees too fast and too dense. 2, the site preparation. And 3, and we did one study where we actually on site prepped areas, I had a graduate student look at food plots. We actually literally planted the fruiting shrubs, stuff like that, and demonstrated you can. It can work. You just have to. It's a lot of work if you wanted. But and then you
don't say.
Andrew Braid was a master student.
I know Andrew. We fought fire together.
Yeah, he was a firefighter originally. So and then the third issue I see is herbicide.
Right.
So traditionally, from what I understand, herbicides really weren't used as often prior to the late 1990s. And since then, since roughly 2000, it's been used much more. Well, we're also trying to maintain our ground cover of the type of species bears use.
Totally.
So
sure.
some of those herbicides could be detrimental to that, and it's an issue that we're trying to think of, and
I think it's a big issue in the forest industry as well. Like I have someone coming on next week. We're going to talk exactly about that. About changing, maybe what's the potential for change over to successional forestry and away from herbicide use.
Yeah,
and to be honest, I was thinking about it more as getting away from it because the public doesn't like it, and not from an impact that it's bad, but from it. But it could. You're right. But it could be considered bad from the aspect of like shrubs and that kind of stuff for forage, right?
Yeah. Exactly,
so I mean, it's not. Yeah, so it's interesting.
And I guess this comes to the issue of natural regenerating stands and stuff. And I grew up in a place where that was relied on, and there weren't the rules of must maintain conifer, all that kind of thing. Yeah. So I think there's policies that are preventing the way more natural based management of some of these forests that probably promote having to use herbicides when we wouldn't have to use as much of it if we didn't have some of these silly policies in effect.
And that's the interesting part, right? Is like a lot of those policies were put in order because there wasn't enough regeneration coming back from a timber perspective, and from a habitat perspective, it wasn't coming back to what that forest was before it was cut. And so they were put in so that it would do that, but now we're having an opposite effect where it's coming back too fast because of whether it's herbicide or good silvicultural techniques. Yeah. And it's interesting that we've gotten to this point where we're like, hey, we got to do better. And so we started doing what we thought was better, and now we're just like, hey, there's different problems now. We have to go back the other way a little bit and maybe change it, and we're fine tuning, right? Like it's fine tuning. It's it's a balance. It's like the political system, right? You just go too far left, and then you go back to the right, and you go, no, that was a mistake, and go back left again. It's just back and forth all the time, right? We can't make up our minds, and it'll change. You're right, though. The problem with policy is that it takes forever to change, but the good thing about the forest industry is it's flexible in that way, and that if you can prove something in the science that this is going to work, the industry and the government will get on board and they'll go,
it seems like it. It seems like it. I mean, maybe the natural disturbance-based forestry being one of those things that if given the opportunity, they were totally willing to experiment and try it out and scale it up to be implemented if need be. So I think they are receptive. It's be interesting to see where things go, and
it is. It's also interesting to think about, right? Like it's all these. I just want. What's the answer? Yeah,
depends on the question, I guess.
It's
for what you're measuring. Yeah,
right. And there's so much emotion, like, especially with something with like herbicides. There's so much visceral emotion involved, and I get it. But everyone's always like, "Look at DDT, you dum dums." It's like, but not. It's not DDT. It's fine. It's different. It's
most of the food
a lot different.
Is based on herbicide too.
So So it's, and I get it. I get but it's just interesting. You want to know what the answer is, and I love how everything. I feel like we're living in a time now where all of these different segments of environmental sciences are coming together and finding a way forward. Where before, I think it was a lot of individual stuff, right? Whereas now everyone's starting to collaborate and talk more, and
it's more integrative, more collaborative.
I love it.
More, I'd say, conservation biology, which is I'd say was my discipline and specialty, is it always had an emphasis of the social sciences and things like that, more so than the other, ecology in general. But it's even more so today. Like it's really recognized co-management, social economic perspective as well as the biological.
Yep.
And that's how we're going to have to manage our resources. It's a social ecological environment. So
it's very cool. I was switching gears a little bit back to bears. So I listened to, and I'm sure you know all about this. There was a podcast done by the Narwhal, the Undercurrent. It was on Bear 148 in Banff. I'm sure you know all about Bear 148, right? Like, so Bear 148 was a grizzly bear, a female grizzly bear, right? And she was in Canmore or something like that. And she lived in the Canmore area, and people would see her regularly, and she was not a problem. And the only time there was problems is when you had like a dog chasing her around or whatever, right? Yeah. And at some point she got something like that happened. There was some kind of situation where there was a dog that was off leash, wasn't supposed to be off leash. It kind of was chasing her, and she kind of didn't chase, but like made sure the dog knew to get the hell out of its business. And the bear followed the people back to their parking lot. Yeah. And people are like, they chase us back to the parking lot. You're like, listen, if a grizzly bear wants to
Yeah.
catch you, it's gonna catch you.
Yeah,
like it's not, you
it's
don't
lot
stand a
faster than
chance.
you. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it wasn't chasing you. It
Yeah.
was keeping an eye on you because it
Yeah.
didn't know you and it didn't trust you. Anyways, and it got, so it was decided that it got from, it's a really good podcast. It did a good
Yeah.
job explaining all the little details that went into this bear being relocated
Yeah, exactly.
and then eventually shot in BC.
Yeah.
And so it was this big visceral amount of emotion
Yeah.
that just everyone was infuriated that
Yeah.
they're it's kind of like the Cecil the Lion thing, kind of,
Yeah.
right? It's along those lines where they had a name for it. I mean, it was
Yeah.
Bear 148, but it was a
well,
name.
They
And-
purposely try to use a number so they don't personalize it, but it still
Right.
becomes personalized. Yeah.
And so what I wanted to ask along those lines
Mm-hmm.
of, especially in places like Banff and Jasper and that kind of stuff, where bears are so you're driving down the highway and there's one sitting there looking like
Yeah.
a teddy bear with his feet out in
Yeah.
front of it, right? And people are taking photos
Yeah.
and everything.
Yeah. Habituated to people.
They're
Yeah.
habituated.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing if as
Yeah.
long as people are minding their P's and Q's and aren't idiots. So I wanted to ask you, like, the personification of bears and just the
Mhm.
idea of living with bears and that kind of stuff is, in your opinion, do you think like personifying bears is a net good or net? Obviously, there's good and bad. Do you
Yeah.
well, how do you rationalize it to
Yeah.
people when you have this conversation with your
Well,
colleagues?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting issue. I mean, it's first of all, like in conservation, we'll often categorize species into types of species, and people in ecology have often talked about keystone species that are instrumental in influencing the habitats of many species, like a beaver or something.
Yeah.
But we also think of something called flagship species in conservation. So these are species that garner the majority of the attention of the public and the conservation dollars, to be honest, and the wildlife management dollars and things like that. So the resources, and grizzly bears are one of them,
Right.
and caribou is another one, and sage grouse is another one, and lions in Africa and so on. And some people hate that because they do not want to see one or a few species getting the vast majority of resources and attention when there's all these other critters around. So,
tough
and
to
I can
compete
see
with-
that. I can see that. That's a problem, right? I mean, if we're truly managing for biodiversity, then why are we picking and choosing a couple things? Well, I guess my counter of that would say that's a totally valid argument. Ideally, we'd always manage for biodiversity, but we can't even measure biodiversity yet because it's more things than we can possibly measure. And usually our shortcut for that is managing habitats. We call that coarse filter conservation.
Sure.
First manage the habitats, and most of the species will come along for the ride. We'll kind of get them. So make sure we have some old growth, make sure we have some early cereal and this and some protected areas and so on. And you assume the species that inhabit those habitats will do fine. The problem is some species fall through the cracks. And so we call this fine filter conservation. We kind of filter out the ones that didn't work on the habitat-based conservation.
Yeah.
And why didn't they work? Well, because people shot too many of them, or it didn't necessarily have to do with habitat itself, or some very complicated thing like interaction of wolves and caribou and other ungulates and stuff. And so my feeling is, we always should promote management and maintenance and of habitats and minimize habitat loss. The first goal in conservation. But there are these other species, and some of those species, they're going to garner more attention, like grizzly bears. But we can also maybe hope that they're another term in conservation. We say umbrella species.
Sure. Yeah.
And we think of them as being maybe they'll also be an umbrella. That is, they'll capture many species through its management. We've looked at this a little bit with grizzly bears as well. Emily Saccone, a master's student, just finished in my lab. But, I've always thought that my general argument on this has been that grizzly bears have a very large territory size. And if you had to maintain a population of grizzly bears, you'd need a large amount of land. And a large amount of land means you're going to include a lot of species no matter what.
Right.
And if you take that as compared to a songbird with, a 1 hectare territory size and a 1,000 square kilometer territory size, which will have more species?
Good point.
The
I like that.
species area relationship in conservation and ecology is one of the oldest laws. That is, more area will contain more species. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
And so a crabbed beetle have an even more a smaller territory size.
Yeah.
And the territory of an individual beetle will have even fewer species than a territory because it's just smaller.
Of course, yeah.
Now the flip side is what we'd also call surrogacy. And I tend to think of surrogacy as controlling for a unit area. So if you took the crabbed beetle territory size, and he used that exact same territory size as where that one songbird you were studying used as compared to where grizzly bears use. Now, which has the greater diversity? Well, who knows? Grizzly bears may actually be lower or average or random, and maybe the crabbit is better on a per unit area. So like per square meter or per hectare. But we're still trying to manage at the population scale, and we know that, well, the area effect will trump that surrogacy effect any day, because the species area relationship will always say more species with bigger area.
Right.
So is it fair that grizzly bears and caribou and those things are, get most of the attention from the public, or even from government agencies for how we spend the the dollars for management? Probably not, but it's they're the ones that are the most vulnerable that we know of.
Totally. There's
also, of course, the Species at Risk Act that requires things to be spent on other things, including some species that don't garner as much attention. Yeah. So I'm kind of basically saying I'm okay with it, given that I think there's these net benefit overall. But I recognize the controversy and how some people would be put off on the use of how the public really connects with grizzly bears. And Courtney Hughes was a PhD student in my lab who finished the other year, and that was what she looked at. She looked at kind of how the persona of grizzly bears and how it influences our perceptions of management and conservation. Right. And she looked at both sides though. So she looked at, the only good bear is a dead bear, or the fact that the media in general, if there's a newspaper article like Bear 148, what got the newspaper article? The fact that the bear followed back and it was this so-called aggressive behavior by the bear. There was not an article about how good Bear 148 was and was living with people in Banff National Park and Canmore area forever. Yeah. So it's like, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So if there's a controversy, and there's been other studies like on sharks globally that, like when the movie Jaws came out in the late 1970s, it's like the worst thing possible for conservation of sharks. Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Everyone is super afraid.
You got a shark. Yeah. And now it's shark fin soup. It's just like, you killed a shark. You're a piece of shit.
Yeah. Like, exactly. Now it's switching a bit. It's taken a long time. Yeah. But there was a massive negative attitude towards sharks for decades. Yeah. And that allowed folks to persecute sharks, and allowed folks who thought that the conservation of sharks were important because they were a apex predator that maintained the food web of the oceans. Yep. They thought they're super important species, but they could get nowhere in conservation for decades because who really even likes sharks? Yeah. Well, we've talked earlier, there is that aspect of grizzly bears. There's folks who are very negative towards grizzly bears, and then there's the flip side. Usually the urban population is very much into grizzly bears. Of course. And the symbolism that they represent of, often we talked earlier, the rugged mountains, even though that wasn't, that's where we were relegated, and that's the last refuge of grizzly bears. I mean, they were just in a boring grassland before too. But anyway, and you'll see conservation organizations also, if they're a sexier looking species, charismatic. Yeah. Flagship species in conservation is charismatic, sexy, and you can bring in the resource dollars towards conservation on them.
Yeah. Well, you need it. You're not going to by having a giant foundation that started on the carabid beetle. You're going to get no funding. Nobody's going to send you stuff because they're just like, what, beetle? Like, who cares, right? Yeah. You said you show them a picture of a big
colleagues
teddy bear, right?
Carabid beetles, but
there's people,
but exactly the public. Yeah,
the public isn't going to be interested, right? Like, of course, there's individuals who'll be interested, but from a public perspective, you're way more likely to be engaged with someone. I see a podcast that says grizzly bears, I'm be like, yeah. I see a podcast that says beetles. I'm like, well, I might, maybe.
Well, so there's some deeper charisma, evolutionary, charisma, and there's some deeper evolutionary connection to humans and nature. Like, it's been shown that we spend on cut flowers that we give to our wives and girlfriends and weddings and various things. There's an industry that's something like $300 billion a year just on cut flowers, and there's not a $30 billion industry on bryophytes, on moss, to give people. And people have thought, well, why is that? What do flowers represent? What's the symbolism? Are they pretty? But why do we find them pretty? Yeah. And pollinators and so on. And the idea is that evolutionary wise, they were a signal towards a future fruit or nut or grain.
Okay.
So those human societies or cultures that paid attention to flowers were more successful because they remembered the places that flowers were, and they would come back later to harvest what the flower produces, which is a seed.
That makes sense.
Right? So there's a connect. What I'm trying to point out is there are biases in what we perceive in nature as valuable.
Sure.
And as humans, we have tremendous biases in things. We very much favor flowers over bryophytes. We very much favor large ungulates over, cravid beetles or something. Well, why? Well, we got something. There's a deeper connection either through threats. They were as predators or as game.
Right.
And or as for our plant-based diets, seeds, and those people who paid attention to where flowers were, they harvested the seeds later. So I mean, that's a theory about how we are connected. We have these biases towards how we perceive nature and what's valuable and what's important.
Yeah, and people just like monsters, and the
well,
grizzly bears are just
they just
like it, right? And flowers,
fairy tale and so on.
Oh, totally. And flowers, to me, that makes total sense though. I never would have thought about that, the connection to food, right? And they come back the same place, and so that makes sense. I would have just thought it was something, just about aesthetics in the sense of, you asked why is it aesthetically pleasing?
But then this is the issue. Why is it aesthetically pleasing? Right?
I was thinking, well, we human beings have that, like take like the Fibonacci sequence or something like that. Like there's these naturally occurring patterns in nature that we find attractive for whatever reason. Like that's a question for a psychologist, right? Like that's not
so it's proportions and numbers that repeat in nature, and we find them those ratios we find as attractive. Like even the ratio of the columns and buildings to the size of the building kind of match those numbers that we tend to find in architecture pleasing. So
and who knows why that is, but it's but it's I agree that you need to have these charismatic species that bring in the attention, and then that money can be focused where it needs to be focused. And
exactly.
Like you said, the big charismatic species are the ones that are going to encompass the largest amount of area, largest amount of species.
They generally do.
It's going to be a good way to do it, rather than trying to have a bunch of individual, projects trying to get money for the beetle, trying to get money for the mite, trying to get money for the rabbit or whatever, right? It's going to be harder. It's going to be washed out.
It's awfully hard to get resources to do that because it's expensive to measure these things. And although grizzly bears, it's much more expensive than songbirds and so on, it's still we literally can't measure everything out there. So we have yet to truly measure biodiversity, to be honest. Because someone would say, well, did you measure this or that? It's like, well, that was just vertebrates. What about mites? What about bacteria? What about, I mean, it could go on, and there's no example that I know of that has tried to actually truly measure total biodiversity on it.
Well, ABMI was trying there.
So ABMI is the best example of trying to hit the major taxa, the organismal groups that either are valuable to us or they consider as good indicators, including mites. But it's the vertebrates and the plants are the primary basis. So it's songbirds and mammals and vascular plants, and there are the bryophytes and lichens, and then the mites and things like that.
But it's a start. But it's like
it's way better than the vast majority of anywhere else on the planet. So I mean, they're trying to tackle a large swath of Alberta's biodiversity.
I just the idea talking about like bears and that whole the emotional aspect of it, and the connection to it, and people tying so much of their own selves into the having bears nearby, but then there's the reality of people are shitheads and they do dumb stuff, like let their dogs off leashes when they're not supposed to in a bear zone where they know there's a grizzly bear. And it's like, so it's when you start to talk about those types of things, you start talking about living harmoniously with something like grizzly bear, something as charismatic and potentially dangerous as a grizzly bear. There's so many angles to that conversation and how you view it, right? And there's no, I don't think there's a right answer, but I think it is like in that Bear 148 podcast or whatever, they were talking about what is like a good grizzly bear. Like, is a good, do we want a grizzly bear that is by itself in the middle of the bush in the mountains, or is a bear that is habituated to humans that is not a problem? Is that a good bear? Because it's not a problem, and we get to see it. So it brings in money. It brings in all kinds of resources because it's there. It's not an issue unless somebody tries to feed it.
Well, that's only that would be the only issue. I mean, for the most part, those habituated bears inside the parks are it's probably it could be a good scenario as far as they kind of coexist. The only issue is you are going to eventually run into a scenario of the dog off leash and that bear actually having cubs.
Yeah.
The cubs are going to get scared of the dog. They're going to react. That sow is going to be extremely protective. And then it's that one instance that happens, right?
Exactly.
Or, maybe
that's the
maybe
cost
her health and her teeth start wearing down. And because she's already habituated, she's a little more aggressive and goes into the edge of people's yards in Banff National, in the town side of Banff or Canmore, and is trying to get to an apple tree or a raspberry bush or something else, and then, gets in trouble kind of thing. So it's I guess there's not even a right or wrong there.
No.
It's I think there's variation. The one interesting story I would say is some colleagues of us in Sweden who have been doing in Norway, working on bears in Sweden, brown bears in Sweden. Remember I talked about them going through that persecution period for hundreds of years, and their numbers went through a bottleneck of low number of bears, roughly about 500 brown bears in all of Sweden, for centuries.
Yeah.
Those bears that survived centuries, they definitely had different behaviors than probably the bears that were removed.
Of course.
So it's selected for bears that were timid of people, non-aggressive. And they even did experiments where they had GPS collars on the bears, and they put the relocation rate of when they knew where the bear was to like every 5 minutes so they could watch it. And they'd say, oh, it's laying in the forest. It's bedded down in the forest here. Let's do an experiment and let's approach the bear walking directly into it. But with this is kind of weird, right?
That's so much fun. I want to do that.
Yeah, with the rule of they didn't allow the researchers to go, I think it was something like 50 meters, closer to 50 meters. So they had their handheld GPS. They know the bear is there. They're walking into it. And then they veer off at the last second and they watch the behavior of the bear. More often than not, you know what it did? It hunkered down and went as low as possible to probably like, you can't see me. I'm laying down here next to the tree roots and so on.
Yeah.
Didn't move. Why? Because centuries before, if you moved, that person who came in 50 meters had a bow and arrow or a gun or something else or dogs or whatever, and it would have been dead. It's selected for these bears to be extremely timid.
That's fascinating.
Now,
That's
in
cool.
North America, we haven't had hundreds and hundreds of years of this selection. So, matter of fact, the people in Scandinavia look at our brown bears or our grizzly bears, and they're like, man, they're aggressive.
Yeah.
So there's a couple attitudes. One is maintain hunting to demonstrate to the bears that be wary of people.
So it's a hazing, basically.
Essentially a hazing.
Yeah.
And they use hazing and those type of things as even some tools in some like Kananaskis country and things like that. Or the flip side is, in the long term, you're selecting for these more timid type bears.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, my colleague Gordon Stenhouse, when he was over in Sweden, helping capture and collar bears with a collaboration that we've had a number of years back, they don't even carry guns when they're capturing and then collaring, they're tranquilizing their bears. And there's actually a YouTube video of one group trying to capture, I think it was a 2-year-old bear, so smaller, in Sweden, just by netting it over the den with nothing else. And everyone in North America would be like, you'd be crazy to do that.
Oh my God, yeah.
Because our bears are too aggressive. So there is, I guess this also shows the adaptation and the long-term selection with coexistence between humans and bears.
That is cool.
But we are in the very early phases, and I don't know which direction. And I think there's different strategies. I think the hazing side, I think hunting is a tool once population size is recovered. I think there's all these things, and that adaptation is a very, very long, slow process. So it's not something that's overnight anyway. Yeah. But you're seeing a little bit of that and start emerging in Jasper Banff with the type of bears who get habituated. They're used to it. Yeah. They're less aggressive, but they still have those, it's still in the back of their brain. They've got, if they feel threatened or a dog,
they're still a bear.
They're still a bear, right? So it's that 1 in a million that creates the problem.
Yeah. And
if you're an agency like a national park or the provincial agency here in Alberta, do you want to take the liability? Well, maybe of that. So what if this is the issue? What if they had the bear collar? They knew it was a bit aggressive a couple times towards someone, but nothing eventually happened. Then the next time it was aggressive and killed someone would say, you already knew they were being aggressive to someone. Why didn't you step in and manage that bear by translocating them or that kind of thing? So it's it's a very difficult situation for the agencies to be in, to be honest.
Oh, for sure. To make that decision. Because if you translocate a bear that everyone knows.
Everyone was like, why did you move 148?
Yeah, they're pissed.
Yeah.
And then it gets shot, and then they're even more pissed. But
the flip side is 1 year later, maybe there was this other instance where she had cubs or something, and it just triggered it, and she actually attacked.
Yeah.
And then they would have said, why did you not move it? So it's a catch-22. You can't.
No. You win some, you lose some.
Yeah.
I had
in the grand scheme, if we had large enough populations, maybe you can move more or remove more from the population is not a big deal anyway. But it's almost like, especially in Banff and Jasper, although you see the bears there, their population sizes aren't very massive because they're all down in the valley. They're not sitting up in the glaciers on the top of the peaks, So removing a couple here or there is actually not that great from their population size.
Right. Yeah. I had an interesting thought when I was listening to that and listening to you talk about it. Was just kind of devil's advocate a little bit, but maybe having 1 million people a week come through an area where there's grizzly bears and you lose a person every 10 years. Maybe that's the cost of doing business in the bush, right? With grizzly bear. Like, you know what I mean? Like the fact that you have that many people go through, I don't know what the numbers are. I don't know if it's 1 million, but whatever. You have a certain number of people, a huge amount of people going through grizzly bear territory, and you only have one person die every decade or so. It's like, I see that as a positive.
Like, to me, that's pretty good. Leopold was already kind of talking about those things 70 years ago. It's like the cost of he wasn't talking specifically about grizzly bears and deaths, but he was like the risk rewards. Yeah. And inevitably, sitting at home, your risks are really low, but your rewards are low. Yeah. The rewards are much higher if you have the opportunity to spend time in wilderness, but your risks are, the rewards are higher, but the risks are higher. And to me, it's like, some people, that's what he was also getting at, is to imagine being able to be in a place that actually still has grizzly bears. That's amazing. Yeah. And then be able to see them. Yeah. Or their sign, big track in the same trail you're walking on. Oh, yeah. That'll get the hair standing up a little bit on the back of your neck. Oh, yeah, right? Absolutely. That's a good thing, right? I mean, that would be his perspective of you're actually experiencing nature. Mm-hmm. But, the flip side is, once in a while there are going to be some accidents, but it's not just grizzly bears. And most people would point out there are more people who are dying in avalanches and rock falls and even insect, bee stings and stuff like that. Or just being, even with bear attacks, it isn't always a mortality, isn't always a human killed. And, there's every year, there's so many people are injured in parks and knees taken out and so on. So I think it's that issue, but it's still, how can you argue with the one person who was, attacked and their family? So it's very difficult. Yeah. But I think that's where, like you said, 1 million people in a place like Banff National Park, of course you're going to bump in and have problems, and people should be aware of that risk reward. Yeah. And if they're willing to walk down that trail with their dog off leash, there's a risk.
You got to pay the price, right? Like especially when the government is telling you not to do
it. There's a sign there that says, "Do not do this."
Yeah, so it's an interesting one for sure, because it's like I think about myself if I was out hunting or whatever, and I get gored by an elk or whatever, right? It's like I'll be pissed that I got gored by an elk, but I'm not going to be angry at the elk.
I'm not going to blame the
I don't want people to go out and kill the elk out of revenge. Yeah. It's like, no, like I effed up and I was in its space and it was the better creature at that point in time. It's like, the same thing goes for bears. Like the onus is on not just the bears to be good. I mean, they're goddamn bears. Yeah, for Christ's sakes. Like, let's be honest. Like they're allowed to be bears.
Well, that's what people are saying. Let a bear be a bear.
Yeah, and like if we need to be cognizant that they're around and be careful and take onus on ourselves to be responsible. Yeah. We're smarter than they are. We have the ability to adapt around them and to be careful. And if we don't do those things, that's our fault. Yeah.
I worry most about foreigners. There's instances in Yellowstone National Park where they try to put their children on top of bison. Yeah, Jesus Christ. And then they're told later these are wild bison, and they're like, they're wild? I thought they were like the zoo, or
they don't know.
Like they had no concept of actual wild of situations, because they're coming from places, let's say Tokyo or somewhere else, that they don't have wildlife. Oh. And so, that I worry most about those people if they're not really perceiving risk. I mean, most Canadians and stuff would probably have a bit of.
It's not usually.
It's different. It's so different for them, right? And then they see them on the side of the road. It's no big deal. Or get out, take photos, or put their kid on top of a bison or whatever.
It's fascinating. Oh yeah. Yeah. It happens all the time. And then but even non-tourists, like even you drive through Banff or something like that in September, you'll see a bunch of bull elks down the side of the road.
Yeah.
People are getting as close as possible. It's like those things. It has swords on its head. What are you doing?
I know. It's so impressive though. Everyone wants to,
like
get a shot. But
especially
that time when they're in rut, it's just crazy. Yeah.
So it's an interesting conversation to have, but it's always people want to jump to. Well, it's two sides of the thing, right? It's either why'd you move it? Why'd you kill it? It was fine. Yeah. Or why didn't you move it? Why didn't you kill it before it did the thing? And it's just there's no matter what they do, it's going to be a lose-lose.
Exactly. This is what I'm saying. It's so hard as a agency to make those decisions.
It's
so
tough.
It's anyway, it's an interesting issue. But
so hour and 45 minutes. Maybe we should wrap it up. Do you have any kind of final thoughts for? I mean, a lot of the people that listen to this are industry professionals and stuff like that, right? Like they're harvesting cut blocks or or something, right? They're involved in environmental sciences one way or another. Along that line of thought, do you have any kind of final thoughts that you would like to put out there? Any advice or whatever regarding whether it's grizzly bear management or how they can start to be an agent of positivity in that sense? Yeah.
Well, I mean, boots on the ground. I mean, I think the folks on the ground are the innovative folks who often can have great ideas and ideas about how to implement change.
Yep.
And maybe that can eventually have some influence on policy and so on. But to me, it's, we've talked a lot about access and road management. And we've talked a lot about, some about silviculture and some about kind of forest planning and the general side of things like larger clear cuts and things like this. I think continuing to be innovative in the way that we access our resources while being more and more wildlife friendly, conservation focused. We've been that, but as you can see, we continue to need to be engaged in that side of things to demonstrate sustainability of not only the production of trees and forests, but the species and the biodiversity with it. And we talked about some species are a bit harder to manage, and grizzly bears are kind of one of those. But I've also argued they're probably the easiest of the win-win of the threatened species in Alberta. Yeah. And especially being charismatic and things like that, it's I think a great opportunity to showcase that we can manage our resources in a way that can sustain a species like that.
Totally. No, I agree. It's that's kind of something I've been saying for a little while. Is just like, don't be afraid to change the way we do things. Just because we were doing something one way doesn't mean that's the way we have to do it. I mean, most of the time, if you realize something and you do something as a forest professional or whatever that's not in the book, but you can back it up with research or with common sense. Like, common sense is a tough one. You should have some research, someone to back you up on it, just to make sure. Yeah. But if you can back it up and prove that what you're doing might be the right way to go, sure, do it, right? Like this, we have to be innovative. Like you said, we have to be not afraid of change. We don't have to do things the way we used to do it. We have to be aware that the monetary incentive can't be the only driver, right? And I don't, not that it is. I'm just saying, like, we have to be aware that as we start to include more values into this management scheme, there's probably going to be less money on the table to be had. But that's the reality of becoming more aware of our surroundings, right?
Well, with certification, FSC, and these other things, I mean, it's expected now. And I think the last thing I'd also say is, although this issue like grizzly bear management is a very large scale question from the policy and landscape management and broader access management for roads, I also think at very, very, very small scales. So the practitioner who is in the harvest design or the actual block and the clear cut, thinking about food plots for grizzly bears, all those little things, if they were done in many, many places, would add up to be a net benefit.
Right.
So it's, I guess in that perspective, I mean, there's certain type of habitats that, although they're generalists, bears are more benefited than others. Yeah. And maintaining fruiting shrubs is probably one of the easiest key things that if we could do within the harvest blocks.
Okay.
And that to me, that would be a big win, is if we could design our within block kind of harvest to be a little more friendly towards those things, even at small scales.
Sure.
Over many, many years and over many, many harvest blocks, it would add up to being even more productive.
Gotcha.
More productive harvest blocks means faster recovery.
Yeah.
for bears, which is what everybody wants.
Right, for sure.
Conservation community, hunters, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no argument with that. I mean, well, I guess there's a few people, the knuckleheads,
always,
that don't want more bears, but
yeah.
there's generally that's what most people's objectives and goals are.
For sure. No, that makes sense. That's perfect, man. Well, I
Great.
appreciate you taking the time to come on here and talk about this. It's I love these conversations.
Yeah.
They just get you. I always have all these like fractured branches going off in my mind of conversations I could have on top of this, but we got to end it at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, thanks a lot for coming on, man. This is great. Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I know I really enjoyed talking to Scott. Yeah, he's got a lot to say. I'm sure we could have done this for another 4 hours. Like I was saying, my mind was all over the place. I had so many questions, but got to keep it to something listenable, I suppose, for you guys. Yeah, don't forget to rate and review. Tell a friend. Stop right now. Tell a friend. Tell them how cool it is and how you learn stuff, and you want more people to listen to it, so that I can justify making more of these things. I appreciate it. It means a lot. It really does. If you put in a rating or a little review on iTunes or whatever, it really helps out a lot. So I really appreciate it, guys. If you guys have any questions for me or Scott, shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will definitely get back to you. I always do. And yeah, that's it for this week. We'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.